Hi, and welcome back to Research Methods. Before I start today, I just wanted to say that it was a pleasure to speak to some of you over the Google Hangout this past week. I'm going to try to set up another one for the end of this week, and I will be sending an email out about that. I just wanted to try to get the entire class together, and it seems that the LIU email is not very supportive of the Google Hangout technology, so we'll try to fix that. But today we're going to talk about kind of the process of research as it relates to writing a paper, and I think it's kind of timely because in 2 weeks you have your first part of your research project due, which is the bibliography and the research question. And I've kind of provided the research question for you, so I really expect to see more about the bibliography and what kind of references you've come up with. So let's first just recap for a moment and talk about research in general. And just to say that it is a systematic pursuit, a systematic endeavor that requires many, many different components, and I'll go through those components in today's presentation. It also is a process, which means it can actually be quite lengthy, and as I mentioned before, it could be 1.5 to 2 years before you get something published, and although that seems like it is very tedious, there's no doubt about it, it's very gratifying once that does happen. And in that process is included a lot of different kind of components, as I said, a lot of different signposts as you go along the journey. We'll talk about some of those today. Obviously, there is collection of information, and that collection could either be looking forward in a prospective study or looking backward in a retrospective study. However, there is collection of data, which is really what informs your findings and therefore what you need to publish. And of course, there is advancement. And there's advancement in many ways. There's advancement of your own knowledge of a topic, which is extremely important. But there's also advancement of what is in the literature currently. And this brings me to my next slide and really the entire crux of what this particular presentation is about, which is really the process of writing. How do we go about, sitting down and writing an actual research project? And some of you have done that, and I think it's an excellent endeavor, an excellent experience to have. But I'd like to go through it piece by piece. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select a topic, and there are so many topics out there. I just actually came up with a topic which I'm going to use for this presentation, which is a little bit different than what I've given you, but the topic is the effect of infomercials on the health of this country. As you know, or maybe you don't know, but at sometime between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning, there are these infomercials that started when QVC started in the 1950s, and they've just become a little bit more sophisticated as we've moved on. Infomercials sold everything from the Thigh Master to herbal supplements to P90X to any of the several exercise videos that you see out today, and they sell a lot of them. So there seems to be a lot of people watching TV at those times of the morning. So I selected that topic because I felt that it was broad enough to kind of get an idea of, what the impact might be on a large population, but I also thought it was quite current because there are still infomercials out today. We see them all the time. And I was just wondering what kind of impact those infomercials had on overall health, because we know that, there's an increase in sales of these products, but do people really use them, and did they use them to the point where they changed their lifestyle? So that's the selection, or that's the topic for this particular presentation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to write down the aims. And what are the aims? Well, In a grant situation, aims usually come in a one-page synopsis. It's usually a list of what the researcher aims to prove or what they aim to examine. And in this case, with looking at the effect of infomercials on overall health, there are a couple of things that I would aim to kind of examine. Number one, I would aim to see what kind of demographic do these infomercials actually play to. Are they younger individuals? Are they older individuals? And of course, then you would ask the question, well, there are so many different infomercials, they probably have different target audiences. Well, you're absolutely right. So maybe instead of looking at just general infomercials, maybe I narrow it down. Maybe I narrow it down to just exercise equipment infomercials. Or I narrow it down to herbal supplementation infomercials. Or I narrow it down to gastrointestinal product infomercials. So what's happening here is I selected the topic, it was very broad, and all of a sudden I said to myself, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to research this topic as broad as it is, I'm really not going to find much I'm not going to advance the knowledge in a particular way. I may come up with some very vague and general conclusions at the end, but it's really not going to help in terms of advancing a certain and particular population or subset. So I need to set my aims very, very clearly, and then I need to set my objectives to those aims. This is what I plan to do. So I plan to research all of the infomercials that have been on television from the years 2008 to 2015. I also plan to take a look at the sales numbers for all of those infomercials related to exercise equipment. I also plan to try to get information on individuals who have purchased those pieces of exercise equipment to see if they are continuously exercising. That might be a difficult one. But usually there's about 2 aims, and sometimes there's 3 objectives to each aim or 2 objectives to each aim. And you can see how now what I've done is I've taken this very broad concept of the effect of infomercials on the health and people in this country, and I've really narrowed it down. Again, I could look at any subset I want, but I've narrowed it down to be a little bit more focused, to be more kind of pinpointed. And then my objectives are very, very clear, and my objectives to the aim must be connected, meaning the objective that I write for the aim of, let's say, looking at the number of infomercials, on exercise equipment, I have to have very, very clear objectives linked to that aim. So that when somebody reads this one-page synopsis, they know exactly what I'm willing to examine and exactly how it's connected or associated with that particular aim. It is imperative that you take your time. Imperative. Because, and I kind of stress this because, I understand you guys have very, very busy lives. And, this class is not your only class, and I'm sure you have many other responsibilities outside of this class. And I am very much aware of that. But I also am aware that, when you get an assignment, and this is not any kind of admonishment or anything. It's not a punishment. I'm just saying when you get an assignment, you need to do it piecemeal. You see the picture of the guy on the slide in front of you. He's rubbing his head because he's really having a difficult time doing something, whatever it is, studying, understanding, or whatever. Give yourself the time to go through this slowly. You don't have to sit down for 8 hours and try to come up with aims and objectives and reading tons of studies. Do it little by little. Spend a half an hour, 40 minutes, maybe every other day doing it. But by the time 2 to 3 weeks rolls around, which is when the first piece of your research project is due, and that doesn't even include your aims, you'll have something. So really take your time. And the next point is don't get trapped. And I'm sorry, but I messed that up. The next point is don't get trapped. And that basically means, I apologize. This is not working out the way that I wanted it to. But apologize for that. Give me a moment. Okay, they come up at the same time. That's why when I hit the button, it went over to the next slide. Don't get trapped. In other words, don't find yourself at the end saying, oh my God, I have to read all these research studies and I have to come up with aims and what is this? And because a true researcher, the person who is the expert in the room, is the one who has done the most work in terms of looking back and seeing what's been done before. Now, let me tell you, very openly and transparently, I already looked up the effect of infomercials on health in the United States. I found one scholarly article on it. That doesn't necessarily mean that I wouldn't find more. I did a very cursory kind of search for it. But maybe there's not a lot out there. And maybe that is a topic where you say, hey, wait a second. You know what? This could be a really interesting thing. Number one, let's talk about who this impacts. It impacts the health of the country for sure, because there are still a lot of people who watch TV at those times that infomercials are aired. It also impacts the infomercial industry, because if they realize they're either getting to less people or more people, maybe they change the way that they do things. So it could have a lot of impact. It also may impact the scientific literature and discuss, what the effectiveness of exercise equipment actually is that's sold on infomercials. It may impact the manufacturing industry to show, what about the quality of these pieces of exercise equipment. So there's a lot of different impacts. So going back to my point, don't get trapped so that you're doing this last minute. Do it thoroughly. Do it with a lot of insight and a lot of due diligence, and you'll find that your research will be extremely high quality and you'll be very, very proud of it. So again, it's just something that I wanted to emphasize before we move forward. So the first piece of what we do and how we decide whether or not this is going to be something, this topic is going to be something that is worthwhile, is we do a literature review. And therefore, what we do is we critique articles in our area of interest. And in this case, of course, the effect of infomercials on health. First, what I would do is I would search infomercials. I would get a very general description of what they are, how long they've been around, a nice history about them, what kinds of things have been sold in infomercials, what kind of networks use infomercials, all of that, how long they've been there, and everything. And then I would take a look at the effect, or I would take a look at exercise equipment, and I would look at exercise equipment. There's many different kinds of exercise equipment. Those that can be sold on an infomercial, like a Thigh Master, and those that you might find in a fitness store. That's an entire cable setup with weight stacks and stuff like that might not be sold on an infomercial. There's also DVDs that could be sold in an infomercial, and DVDs that might be sold in a store. So many different kinds of exercise equipment. But again, get a real kind of broad concept of exercise equipment. Take those two major concepts and then start to try to find articles that combine the two. Are there articles on the effect of things like P90X? Are there articles on, I don't know if you remember Tony Little, who used to sell a tremendous amount of exercise equipment online, in infomercials. Are there articles on the effect of Suzanne Summers and her effect on health and the Thigh Master? Where are those articles? And then what you should do is organize the articles by category or subtopic. So you're getting all this general information on infomercials, you're getting general information on exercise equipment, then you're looking at a combination of the two, and then you're going to subcategorize. You're going to make subtopics, and those subtopics could be exercise equipment for people over the age of 50, exercise equipment for people, ages 20 to 40, exercise equipment that includes resistance training, exercise equipment that is electronic, whatever. You can make all these subtopics, start to build an arsenal of articles that give you an idea of what this topic is kind of going to form into. Now, it is not necessary to be the expert right away. However, if your literature review is deep enough and if you are persistent enough to go back to the articles maybe from the 70s and 80s or whatever, if you're going back that far to kind of get that history, you become the expert or the go-to person about the topic. Once you can answer questions that people ask you about the topic in general, but then also ask you questions specifically about subcategories, and you can answer those questions with confidence, you're now becoming the expert on the topic. It is imperative that you become the expert on the topic. And let me tell you why that is. One, you will write a much better research paper by becoming the expert on the topic. If you are someone who leaves things and you're not really kind of paying attention to the topic until 2 days before it's due, you're going to be reading a lot and then just basically copying down, maybe not plagiarizing, but copying down or paraphrasing what was said in the articles, throwing in your 2 cents, and then kind of mishmashing together a research project with a little bit of a little bit of knowledge and maybe a little bit of research and a little bit of glue and whatever else you want to use. But if you do a thorough literature review and really understand all the different nuance of the topic, again, the history, the sales, the marketing, the manufacturing, and everything else that's going into both infomercials and also exercise equipment, you then become a much more knowledgeable individual about the topic, and it just leads to a much more high quality research project, research study, publication, and it also is much more self-gratifying for you as well. It is key that you find the gaps in the literature. So, as I said, I did a little bit of a cursory search on the effect of infomercials on health. I found one scholarly article. I didn't look at any particular subtopics or subcategories, but I assume that there's some stuff there. But maybe there's not information on people over the age of 50, or maybe there's not information on people ages 20 to 40, or maybe there's no information on the effect of these new DVDs, this T25 and T30 and Insanity and Crazy and all these other kind of exercise programs that are now whittled down to 25 to 30 minutes where your heart rate is 180 and then it's 60 and then it's 180 and then it's 60 and then but where is the clinical research? Where's the data to show that this is effective? At the same time, you could also show that it's ineffective. You could look at, clinical chronic conditions related to specific kinds of exercise. We know that insanity is based on an interval training principle, and that's great. And interval training actually has been studied up and down for many, many years and has been shown to be extremely effective for reducing resting heart rate, also for improving the aerobic function of muscle. There's been a tremendous amount of study on that. But what about a particular kind of infomercial or a particular kind of product or a product that's geared toward a particular age group? Find the gaps in the literature. There are gaps in the literature everywhere in every topic. It doesn't matter. Even topics that have been studied for 10 to 15 years still have some gaps in the literature, and interestingly enough, a good researcher at the end of the article will say future research needs to examine X, and there's your gap in the literature. So they're looking for people to add to the scientific knowledge in that way. It's extremely important that you find those gaps. Also, find and identify any similarities between the literature, between the articles that you read and in the literature that you read. So what are the similarities in some of these articles? What are the similarities in the methods? And again, that may help you to kind of contrast that against what it is that you're doing. What you're doing is a little bit different than what they did in the past. We kind of talked about that briefly before. And also find or identify the expectations, meaning what is expected in this area of interest. What kinds of things have been done in the past? What kinds of things are looking to be done in the future? Similar to kind of finding the gaps in literature and identifying the similarities. What are the expectations of what this article should look like? Is this an article where you're actually going to be publishing in a scientific journal? Is it an article you're going to be publishing in a trade journal? What are you looking to do, or where are you looking to go with this in the end? So the literature review is a very, very important component of the entire systematic process. And it really is the springboard off of which you build your research project. So now let's clarify the question. So we've done a lit review, and we've kind of looked at, in general, infomercials. We've looked at, in general, exercise equipment. We've combined the two. We've subcategorized them. Okay, now let's take a look at what kind of question we actually have. What's the question? So the process in this case is circular. And what that means is it always comes back to the question, which informs the method, which informs the findings, it informs the discussion, and then that comes back to the question. So it is circular. Let's look at some pitfalls, though. Okay, there are 4 things here that I'd like to talk about. And the first is lack of sufficient focus. And what that means is whenever I would counsel students on doing research projects, and usually these were for dissertations, so they were pretty long, drawn-out research projects that would be prospective in nature, so meaning they would be collecting data over, let's say, a 10 or 12-week period. We always had to stay focused, which means that a research question must be pinpoint and focused. Whenever you read a really good introduction in a research article, as it comes down to the end of the introduction, you notice that the focus is extremely clear. So it comes down to just one question. And the reason that that's important is because if you lack sufficient focus, you tend to go off on tangents. And once you do that, number one, the research study kind of loses its thread, but also the reader or the person who is objectively kind of examining the study tends to lose interest because you're bouncing all over the place. So very, very important to maintain focus. Try to identify the problem with defining or measuring concepts. So, in other words, we're going to talk next week about qualitative versus quantitative research, but just to give you a quick preview, qualitative research is more about emotion, it's about subjectivity, it's about feelings. Quantitative research is numbers, hard numbers, okay, and usually those numbers are reported in the average, or what's known as the aggregate. So, can you identify problems with defining or measuring concepts? In other words, if I'm looking at the effect of infomercials on health in the US, am I using sales numbers to determine that? Or am I using, interviews with people or surveys with people who basically say, yeah, I've bought 5 pieces of equipment on infomercials in the last 5 years, and yes, my health has improved X amount? Or am I saying, am I getting people who have, a group of people who have bought from this particular infomercial, and then I'm looking at their cholesterol numbers over the last 2 years? What am I doing? Am I looking at emotion? Am I looking at numbers? So those measuring concepts, those defining concepts are extremely important. Try to identify problems that really lend themselves to those concepts being used. My director of my master's and doctoral program always said, never go on a fishing expedition. And I only started to realize what that meant when I started to do research on my own. Sometimes we throw spaghetti up on the wall and we see what sticks, and we take that one and we run with it, right? And what that means is that sometimes, when we're doing a research study, we feel like we need to look at this and this and this and this, and I have 6 dependent variables that I'd like to see a change in. Well, you know what? I guess in some studies that's fine. For some researchers, that's okay. But for the most part, when you have so many variables, what you're often doing is you're fishing for answers. And that's not what research is about. You're not fishing for answers. Research is about developing a very concise and clear question, examining the question, looking at the data, and then reporting on the data. That's it. That's all it is. It's not, let's look at that. Oh, that didn't work? Let's look at that. Oh, that's not working? Let's look at that. And then look at all these dependent variables to see which one actually works. I mean, it's one way of doing an investigation, but that's pretty sloppy. So watch for fishing expeditions. Watch for using too many variables because you can get lost in the sauce that way. Also, lastly, the study must be feasible, meaning you must either have the knowledge through your lit review, which is fine. You could develop that knowledge. You need to have the resources to run the study, and you need to have the proper facilities to run the study. So in order to conduct the study, if I'm doing a study on the effect of infomercials on the health of the U.S., I don't really need major facilities to do that, but I do need knowledge and I do need some resources to do that. I need to know that when I research this particular topic, it is feasible for me to do so. Let me give you a very, very quick for instance. I did my dissertation on the effect of HIV and its medications on autonomic function, which is nervous system function, and cardiovascular fitness. And, you know, dealing with people who had HIV in the mid-90s was not scary, but it was difficult because it was hard to get to these individuals. It was very hard I had to go to Gay Men's Health Crisis. I had to meet people in pizza shops. I mean, it was crazy. But to get them to the lab was even harder. So basically, it was feasible for me to do the study because I had the facilities to do it, and I had the resources to do it, and I had the knowledge to do it, and that's fine. But the part that was difficult was actually getting the subjects into the facilities to actually do the test. So what my point is that you may have all three, knowledge, resources, and facilities, but subject recruitment is also something that's going to make this feasible or not. So if, let's say, for instance, I want to look at the effect of infomercials on the health of Eskimos, well, that's great. I could do that. I have the infomercials, and I don't really need a facility, but I have no access to Eskimos. So if I don't have access to my subject pool, the study's not feasible. Make sure it's doable, make sure it's feasible, and you can get it done in a timely manner. Okay, halftime. I don't know if you've ever seen these guys run around, if you've ever been to a baseball game, but who do you think's going to win? I think it looks like the guy in the blue and red striped shirt is probably going to win this one, and I don't even know what he's supposed to be. But anyway, so now you've worked out your research question. You may have set forth a hypothesis, which we'll talk about a little later in another discussion, and now you have some direction. But here's the most critical part. The most critical part, even though you've come up with a really cool question, you've got a prediction of the direction this question is going to go, you feel really good about your research study, but you've got a critical part now, and that's called research design. So now you need to design your study. It's one thing to come up with a question and come up with sort of a direction, but now you need to set the design of the study that's going to allow you to collect the data in a way that is going to be both high quality, low burden, right? As much low burden as possible on you and your subjects, but is also going to give you data that is going to be informative. Whether that data is aligned with your hypothesis or not, you need to get information from the research study. So let's see, what's needed? Well, design. There's a lot of different kinds of design. We'll talk about what those designs are, whether they be crossover designs, longitudinal designs, random control designs. This is something that you really need to grapple with. What kind of data are you looking to actually collect? Are you looking to collect qualitative data, quantitative data, a combination of the two? Really depends on what you're looking for. And what are your methods? What kind of procedure are you going to use to collect your data? So this requires a lot of thinking. And a lot of what informs this is what we talked about before. Obviously, your knowledge, okay? You're not going to set up a study design that is some highfalutin study design no one's ever heard of, and then you're going to try to like pull it off. You probably want to go with a study design, a type of template design that's been used before, but that is appropriate for both your subject pool and the type of data you want to collect. Depending upon who you are and what you're looking at, that will inform what kind of data you want to collect. What I mean is, if you are looking to do surveys, then great, you're going to collect qualitative data, and pretty much going to get information on feelings and emotion and subjectivity. It's great. If you're a hard researcher or working in a lab, chances are qualitative data is not really going to be the crux of your study. It's going to be mostly quantitative. But if you're someone who's doing both, then you're going to collect a combination of the two. In terms of your methods, you need to know what your sample size is going to be. You remember the assignment that I gave you last week was about healthy food placement, and their sample size was over 100,000 people. Now, they didn't do a 50-minute study on 100,000 people, you know, on each person. They basically surveyed them, or they actually took a look at what they bought and when they bought it and where they bought it, depending upon where the healthy foods were placed. But their sample size was huge. It was gigantic, and because of that, that's an excellent sample of the population. Some sample sizes in some studies are 10 people. Studies that require muscle biopsies, which could be very, very painful, in cyclists are 7 people. Okay, so you may say 7 people, how could that be a sample of the population? Oh my God, they found significant differences? That's kind of crazy. But who's going for a muscle biopsy these days? You got to get paid a lot of money. They're very painful. They take a long time. And there could be, you know, complications like infection and other things that you have to deal with. So sample size is important. You could do what's called an a priori investigation of your sample size by doing a power analysis, basically taking a look at how many people in your sample you would need to determine that there are significant differences in your variable. Yeah, you could do that. But that's definitely something you need to question and you need to investigate before you begin. Recruitment. What are your recruitment methods? How are you going to recruit people? Are you going to put up flyers on lampposts? Are you going to send out emails? We used to have students actually go into classes and talk about the research that we were doing, and then therefore students would sign up. You can't hold a gun to someone's head. You can't do that. So you have to do it in a way that's unbiased. You have to do it in a way where it's not coercion. And you got to figure out how the best way to recruit is. Oh, by the way, and also in recruitment, you can pay people. So you're going to pay them, you know, $50 to sit down with you for 30 minutes and take a questionnaire. That's pretty good. You probably will get a lot of subjects. And you probably have seen on the subway, you've seen recruitment posters for certain studies that are done at Columbia Presbyterian or, you know, big academic centers. What are your procedures? What kind of procedures are you going to implement? And, you know, what's the step-by-step? What are the subjects actually going to be doing? And lastly, what are the ethics? And that means, what does your consent form look like? What are you asking people to actually do? Are you doing muscle biopsies? Are you doing blood draws? Or are you just doing questionnaires? And again, that really informs the design and how the study is kind of formed. So now let's look at the next piece. The next piece is data collection. In the data collection, there is also methods. How often are you collecting the data? And what kind of data are you collecting, and what's the step-by-step of the collection? And again, that goes into, that also informs the design. When you get the data, how are you acquiring the data? What kind of software are you using? What kind of computer are you using? What What kind of program is it? What do you do in the program? How do you actually look at the data? I'll give you an example. Is that when I did my dissertation, looking at the cardiovascular fitness of individuals with HIV, we had electrodes on them. So we were doing EKG electrodes, and I had basically an EKG rhythm strip in front of me, which was downloaded into a special software, and I literally had to pick every single peak heart rate of a 5-minute measurement. So think about how many times your heart beats per minute, average on 72, multiply that by 5, about 350 beats for about 48 people. That's a lot of heart rates. That's a lot of beats, and I had to actually pick each peak out. So I had to pick the heart rates out of that EKG rhythm strip. That took a long time. It took hours and hours and hours. But that was my procedure. And then from that, the software was able to detect levels of nervous system function as it relates to heart rate. That's a story for another day. But the idea was I had to write that entire procedure down. So it's very important that you're well-versed in the procedure of how you acquire the data, and then how you actually, kind of go through it before you actually analyze it. Next piece is analysis and discussion. What are the analytical methods? Now, those analytical methods can be analytical methods related to statistics, but also analytical methods related to actual data. So like I was talking about, picking out each heart rate, that's part of the analysis. Using special filters and everything else in the software, that's part of the analysis. But what I'm talking about here mostly is what the data analysis, the statistics I'm using. Am I using an analysis of variance? Am I using a t-test? Am I using a multiple variable analysis of variance? Am I using a chi-square? What kind of statistics am I using? We'll talk about some of those later in the class. So I start with the major findings. These are the major findings. I found that 80 people who watch infomercials don't improve their health more than 20% after 2 years. Okay, major finding. And then I try to come full circle, and I try to link it to my research question and my hypothesis. And that's really the crux of a good research study. When you read a discussion and you can see that they actually refer back not only to their question, to the hypothesis, but also they look at the previous literature and they either support it or they refute it, but there's an argument. There's a real thick, intense argument there. Then you know that this person really knows what it is that they're doing. So the discussion is, as I may have mentioned before, a very difficult part to write because you need all the pieces in play to write it. You need all your data, you need your results, you need your analysis, you need your hypothesis, and you need your research question, you need your methods, you need everything. And then what you try to do is you try to not only argue and say, hey, my way is the right way, but you say, hey, in 1995, when infomercials were at their peak, a study was done on the effectiveness, of them in the U.S. However, that population that was examined was the average age of the subject pool was 55. However, our findings are, pertain more to subjects who are ages 20 to 40. So you try to play off what's been done before and say how yours is different. But very important to be aware of statements of absolution. Like, our study is the only study to ever find ... Watch out for those things because they come to bite you in the ass. You can't make those comments without absolutely knowing for sure that you are the only one in the entire world who's ever published in scientific literature who ever did what it is that you said you did. I was told that by a researcher early on. Please be aware of statements of absolution. You can't go out there, because if you're found out and they say, well, wait a second, there was a study that was done 55 years ago that looked at something similar, you look like an idiot. So you might say, instead, our data suggest. Suggestion is not a statement of absolution, but you're conceding to the fact that there may be something else out there. You're just suggesting. And you could say strongly suggest also. That's also not absolution, and it's a way to kind of get around that. Well, you've reached the finish line. The conclusion usually has the limitations of your study. Most people say our sample size was too small, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of a slap in the face. You're slapping yourself in the face and saying, God, how could I do this? How could I miss this? But every study has limitations, and that's why there are gaps in the literature. Because when you have these limitations, it lends itself for other people to kind of come in and add to the literature later on. Some other limitations might be the analyses you did. Some other limitations might be the equipment you used. You're not going to slap yourself in the face too much. Don't write a page and a half of limitations, because there's no point to publish a study. But you should have some limitations, as everybody else does, because if you don't, then your study was perfect and you're perfect, and then that's a whole other issue. Lastly, practical applications, and that is really what I think the coaches really appreciate. As I mentioned before, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and of course the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, with their practical applications for their coaches, is an area that they love researchers to write about, because it really helps tremendously in terms of the performance of their athletes and also what their coaches teach. And then lastly, further research. So, we did this, we did that, and now there needs to be an examination of further research. Now, there's two ways to do this. Some researchers will say, we have already begun research in our lab on this other issue that's linked to the issue we just published on. Or there are researchers that may say, further research should examine X. And then that opens the door to researchers to be able to go out there and add to the literature. Let's put it all together. So, as I mentioned, it is circular. We select our topic. We develop kind of our thinking about a particular topic, start with it being broad. We then go into a review of the literature, taking a look at the topic in a broad sense and narrowing it down to a point, to kind of a focus. We develop that framework, that focus, which leads us to a question and hypothesis, a prediction of what we think is going to happen. We move into a research design. We then collect our data, either retrospectively, prospectively. We do the analysis of our data. We conclude with our data, and then that leads us back to the selection of our topic, the information that we found out from the review of the literature, our question, our hypothesis, our design. The conclusion really embodies kind of everything, and you can see this is kind of a circular process. So, as I mentioned, research, and again, many of you know this, has several components to it. There is somewhat of a formula, though, and in every research article that you'll read, there are very similar components: the background and introduction, the methods and design, the data and the findings, the results, the conclusion, or the discussion, then the conclusion, and that's it. Those are the pieces. You'll notice that we went through a 12-slide presentation, and there's a lot of components within those pieces. There's a lot of emphasis on the fact that research is a very it's an endeavor. It requires persistence. It requires patience. It requires attention to detail. So I'll leave you with, when you're doing your research project and you go back, to these slide presentations, or even this one in particular, looking at these different components and using the example of an infomercial and its effect on the health of people in the US, you notice how we kind of changed that topic a little bit, became much more focused, had our question, had our aims, had our objectives. Very important, and I emphasize that you take your time to do this. It will be much more, as I mentioned before, gratifying to you, obviously gratifying to me. And it will also, I think, it will kind of alleviate the level of intimidation. Much of the intimidation in research comes from the fact that it is so broad and vast and difficult to kind of sift through. But when you narrow down your question, you're on a quest. I hate to sound like very kind of excited about it. Happens to be the way I talk, as you probably know. But what I'm saying is you're on a quest for information. It no longer becomes intimidating. It's now a pinpoint question. It's an examination of a topic. It's not this vast kind of book report idea. And, you know, saying that, I would think book reports are probably more intimidating than is research. Research just takes time. It takes time, and you just have to be detailed oriented. So what we're going to do is we're going to end here, and the next presentation is going to be a little bit more nitty-gritty in terms of quantitative and qualitative analysis and different kinds of terms of research, and, you know, just a little bit more kind of research. What's the word? Not as general, not as vague in terms of just concepts. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was a little bit longer than I wanted. It's about 46 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to put up the assignment as well this week. Hope you have a great week, and I'll be sending out an email about our next Google Hangout. All right, take care.